May 17, 1989. At his alma mater, Bishop Laughlin Memorial High School, Rudy Giuliani declares his candidacy for mayor of New York City. As the most famous law enforcement figure in America since J. Edgar Hoover, Giuliani had attained an almost mythical status through his work as the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. In 1985, he successfully prosecuted the Five Families, the notorious Italian mafia syndicate with mob bosses like Fat Tony Salerno and Big Paul Castellano. He prosecuted Wall Street crooks including the billionaire Michael Milken and Ivan Boesky, the real-life inspiration for Gordon Gekko. From corrupt party bosses to socialites, Giuliani went after them all. As he announced his candidacy, he seemed like the only incorruptible figure who could save crime-ravaged New York. When asked after his announcement why he wanted to move from the U.S. Attorney's Office to City Hall, he cited his desire to be a champion of the poor. He said that even as a prosecutor, he could not ease crushing poverty or end homelessness or treat drug addicts or help people with AIDS. Afterward, Rudy made one of his first campaign stops at a homeless shelter that predominantly housed black and brown New Yorkers. He later attacked the incumbent mayor Ed Koch for dramatically exaggerating the number of homeless who are criminals or mentally disturbed. And when the Reagan administration was completely ignoring the AIDS issue, Giuliani addressed the crisis with a 9-page program, which was more detailed than the 4 candidates running in the Democratic primary. Given the decidedly humanitarian bent in Giuliani's platform, one might assume that he chose to announce his first run for mayor at Bishop Laughlin in order to showcase his values as a Christian who deeply cared about the poor and needy. His record prosecuting white-collar criminals would have made it all seem sincere to many working-class voters, as he was certainly no friend of the elites. Giuliani's progressive-sounding rhetoric contrasted with that of the incumbent Democrat Ed Koch, the combative mayor who liked to pick fights with the media. Koch was ideologically centrist and riddled with corruption by his third term. Republicans hated him, and liberal Democrats had finally become frustrated. In his run for mayor, Giuliani was aiming to break a historical precedent. No mayor in the 20th century who had served at least one full 4-year term had ever lost re-election, and Rudy was running as a Republican in a city where Democrats outnumber Republicans 4-1. Still, there was an opening for a political outsider like Rudy to win with a campaign to clean up City Hall. The last time a Republican had won a mayoral election was John Lindsay in 1965. Lindsay was arguably one of the most left-wing mayors in the history of New York. If Giuliani could take a page from Lindsay's playbook and build a coalition with left-wing voters disillusioned with the Democratic incumbent, he might have a path to victory. Alas for Giuliani, his embrace of progressive policies on AIDS, homelessness, and poverty did not serve him well in his first election. His plan to unite Republicans and left-wing Democrats would collapse after a surprise upset in the Democratic primary, when Manhattan Borough President David Dinkins defeated Ed Koch from the left. Giuliani would lose in 1989, and Dinkins would become the first black mayor in the city's history. 4 years later, Rudy would try again, but this time, he would ditch his original plan of trying to win over both Republicans and left-wing Democrats. Instead, in his rematch against Dinkins in the 1993 mayoral election, Giuliani would capitalize on a wave of racial backlash, and this time, he would win. Rather than drawing over disillusioned left-wing Democratic voters with promises to address poverty or to strengthen out the tangled social safety net, Giuliani convinced New Yorkers to vote for him by stoking their racial prejudices. In a liberal city that has a majority of people of color, Giuliani would narrowly clinch his victory by winning more than 70% of the white vote. Rudy would govern in his first term, not as the empathetic unifier he ran as in 1989, but as the tough, law and order, crime-busting mayor who would clean up the streets of New York. He would subsequently be re-elected in 1997 with the endorsement of unions, liberal newspapers, and gay rights groups, not in spite of, but because of his unrelenting vilification of poor black and brown New Yorkers. He would not only serve 2 terms. In his last few months, when New York suffered its greatest tragedy, Rudy Giuliani would also become the most popular mayor in the city's history.
You had a plenty money, 1922. You let other women make a fool of you. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out here and get me some money too. If you had prepared 20 years ago, you wouldn't be wandering out from door to door. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money too. I fell for your jiving and I took you in. Now all you got to offer me is a drink of gin. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Get out of here and get me some money too. Why don't you do right like some other men do? Like some other men do.
In a recent mini-documentary series, Giuliani, What Happened to America's Mayor?, CNN repeats a familiar misconception when it comes to the political career of Rudy Giuliani. Looking at his downfall, it has become commonplace to say that Rudy has evolved and is somehow no longer his former self. John Avlon, who went from working for Giuliani to now defending his reputation as a CNN analyst, says Rudy got caught in the right-wing echo chamber ecosystem and that he's changed. Ken Friedman, also featured in the CNN report, maintains that the man I worked for in 1993 is not the man who now lies for Donald Trump. To hear them tell it, there was no way to predict that the beloved man known as America's mayor would become the villain whispering in Trump's ear. This is either a rewriting of history or a complete misunderstanding of the man they claim to have known. While his party loyalties may have shifted and his rhetoric can still swing from compassionate to bombastic, Giuliani's core beliefs have remained consistent throughout his entire life. For CNN or any other liberal news outlet to say that he's changed or evolved is an inaccuracy that needs to be corrected. So in part 1 of this series on Rudy Giuliani, I want to set the record straight. To be fair, Giuliani's career does seem like that of a man undergoing dramatic swings in his politics, and it is not uncommon for politicians to switch their party allegiances as well as their philosophy. There are notable political figures throughout recent American history who have gone through an ideological evolution, from Hillary Clinton supporting the conservative icon Barry Goldwater as a teenager, to Ronald Reagan worshipping Franklin Roosevelt in his youth. So perhaps Rudy Giuliani can be lumped together with these and other politicians who have swung from one side of the ideological spectrum to the other. This impression is borne out by a look at Giuliani's early life. When Rudy was 16 years old, he was a fanatic supporter of John F. Kennedy's candidacy for president. By the time he reached voting age during the presidential election of 1964, Rudy wrote an op-ed for his student newspaper at Manhattan College, lavishing praise on President Johnson and attacking his Republican opponent Barry Goldwater as an incompetent, confused, and idiotic man. Another 4 years later, Rudy volunteered for Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign and praised the Democrat for having the support of the minority community. Admittedly, on the surface level, these earlier political leanings seem to support CNN's thesis that Giuliani evolved, but we must reassess them in light of some important historical context. First of all, Rudy's party loyalties may have shifted over time, but so did the parties themselves. The image of the Democrats as a center-left party and the Republicans as a solidly right-wing one is actually a more recent development. For one thing, the Democratic Party of the 1960s may have been the party of the New Deal, but away from these social democratic economic policies, it was, on social issues, the party of white supremacy with its core base in the South. In the same era on the Republican side, we find figures like Mayor John Lindsay, who was a strong voice for the civil rights cause in the North. So Rudy's embrace of Democratic candidates in the 60s should not really be equated with support for socially liberal policies that characterize the Democratic Party of our current era. Giuliani was a loyal Democrat during the time JFK carried the conservative southern states. He transitioned to an independent in the mid-1970s, and he registered as a Republican in 1980, just as the political divide between the blue coastal North and the red heartland South was becoming a reality. In other words, Giuliani's shift from Democrat to Republican coincided with the last great realignment in American history, a far-reaching change that started with Nixon's Southern strategy and culminated in Jimmy Carter's loss of the New Deal coalition. It can be argued, moreover, that Rudy's endorsement of Robert Kennedy was based not on the candidate's actual support for minorities, but on having the support of minority communities. Giuliani understood that to win in the 1968 presidential election, the Democratic Party needed to nominate someone with the ability to communicate with the white middle class. RFK was the most viable candidate because he could form a winning coalition. In Rudy's own words, there was no one else with a foot in both camps. The hint of political opportunism in Giuliani's support for Robert F. Kennedy is further evinced by his earlier infatuation with John F. Kennedy. One could try to make the case that Giuliani was responding to certain conservative aspects of the elder Kennedy's platform. JFK was, after all, running to the right of Richard Nixon with calls for increased military spending and cutting Eisenhower's taxes on the wealthiest Americans. But it doesn't seem likely that 16-year-old Rudy would have been familiar with such policy details. A simpler explanation is that Giuliani cheered for JFK because he was in a position to become the first Roman Catholic president of the United States. The teenage thrill of seeing and even shaking hands with his hero at a parade in Manhattan must only have solidified this religious affinity. He was so starstruck from meeting JFK that Rudy would tell friends during his high school years that his dream was to follow in his footsteps and become the first Italian Catholic president. More than party loyalty, it was Giuliani's ironclad allegiance to the church that has remained consistent throughout his life. And his particular perspective on Catholicism became the basis for his commitment to law and order, whether as a successful prosecutor or a crime-busting mayor. Let's go back to where Giuliani chose to first declare his candidacy for mayor in 1989. In making his announcement at Bishop Laughlin High School, Giuliani was acknowledging a deeply personal connection to the place where he developed the core basis of his ideology. Growing up at the time of the counterculture when women burned bras, drag queens rioted, and Viet Cong flags flew outside the Democratic Convention, Rudy was schooled in the tradition of the Counter-Reformation. He was educated at Bishop Laughlin to reject the liberal Enlightenment philosophy that the state's legitimacy derives from social contracts. Rather, he was taught in accordance with the pre-Enlightenment understanding that sovereignty goes back to the divine right of kings. Unlike the liberal philosophy of John Locke or Montesquieu and their argument that revolt is an inherent right of the people, Giuliani came to believe that authority could never be questioned and disobedience must be faced with persecution. Indoctrinated into these principles, one of Giuliani's earlier career choices was the priesthood. His interest was serious enough for him to visit various seminaries, but, according to Rudy himself, he decided against the priesthood because of his budding interest in the opposite sex. Now, one might find something laudable in Rudy's initial desire to become a priest. But in light of Giuliani's later career, we can suppose that it was not the desire for mercy and forgiveness that prompted Rudy's interest in the priesthood. It was, more likely, the license to enforce rules and dictate a strict code of conduct that first drew him to the clergy. But in the career he chose instead, he found an equally tempting role in which to exercise his pre-Enlightenment ideas. Rudy became a prosecutor. He would get his law degree at Manhattan College and pass the bar exam on November 5, 1968. Coincidentally, and perhaps auspiciously for Rudy, it was the same day Richard Nixon was elected president on a platform that railed against the counterculture and pledged to bring law and order for the silent majority. While Giuliani soon left the Democratic Party, he was still under the spell of the Kennedys. Inspired by Bobby Kennedy's accomplishment in becoming U.S. Attorney General at the age of 35, Rudy was determined to make his own mark. He climbed the ranks quickly, and in 1981, under Ronald Reagan, he became the youngest Associate Attorney General in history at age 36. 2 years later, Giuliani took a job as the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. While this was technically a step down from his previous position working directly for the U.S. Attorney General, the new job offered a very appealing perk, and one that Rudy clearly relished. As the face of the Southern District of New York, Rudy would regularly be on the front pages of newspapers and could play the role of crime-fighting protagonist in the high-profile cases the media liked to cover. And Rudy clearly knew how to play the media game. Like J. Edgar Hoover half a century earlier, he understood how compelling cases could help him achieve both professional and personal goals. Hoover showcased the hunt for the kidnapper of Charles Lindbergh's son to bolster the image of what was then known as the Bureau of Investigation. Giuliani knew how the press would eat up the story of a young Italian from Brooklyn seeking to avenge the honor of Italian Americans by going after the mafia. Usually, a prosecutor who never held an elected position would not be the most viable candidate for mayor of the largest city in America. But through the popular image he cultivated with the help of the press, Rudy Giuliani, by the late 1980s, had made himself a strong contender against the three-termed Ed Koch. At the onset of his first campaign for mayor in 1989, Giuliani strove to be a more soft-spoken, big-hearted candidate in order to create a contrast to the combative style of the incumbent Ed Koch, the man he expected to be running against. Channeling RFK once more, Giuliani's original campaign strategy was to have a foot in both camps, to build a wide coalition with the support of the minority community. His loss in 1989 brought Giuliani back to the drawing board. He would scrap the attempt to appeal to liberals and try, instead, to harness a different current. By exploiting the white backlash against David Dinkins, Giuliani no longer needed to pander to the left. He could be true to his core ideology, which started to become more transparent. As mayor, Giuliani finally had a vehicle in which his authoritarian instincts could be put into action. At last, he had earned the license to act in accordance with his beliefs. Rising to the highest echelons of power, seated at the top of New York City's great chain of being, Mayor Giuliani could now exercise his right to be tyrannical. He clearly articulated this understanding of his job just a few months after he was inaugurated. In 1994, after a young police officer named Sean McDonald was killed, Giuliani faced criticism for his aggressive policing tactics. At a press conference, he attacked his liberal critics, saying, "We see only the oppressive side of authority. What we don't see is that freedom is not a concept in which people can do anything they want, be anything they can be. Freedom is about authority. Freedom is about the willingness of every single human being to cede to lawful authority a great deal of discretion about what you can do." Freedom is about authority. This Orwellian understanding of liberty is the core basis of Rudy's ideology, and contrary to CNN, this has never changed or evolved. Giuliani's despotic view of how democracy should function remained steadfast even after re-election that relied on considerable support from the left. It seems the endorsement of unions, gay rights groups, and even the New York Times did little to change Giuliani's tone of thinking. In 1999, Giuliani was on a radio program and had to field a grievance from a caller whose son had been killed by the police. Before she could finish, Rudy cut her off, saying, "Maybe you should ask yourself some questions about the way he was brought up." It was not enough to take away her son. The grieving mother must show contrition for even questioning the mayor's mandate. He had the highest jurisdiction, and Giuliani was prepared to shut down anyone who dared to question it. Towards the tail end of his second term, just a year before he was named Person of the Year by Time magazine and knighted by the Queen of England, Giuliani provided yet another revealing demonstration of his uncompromising authoritarianism. In 2000, when Patrick Dorshman became the fourth unarmed black man in 13 months to be killed by the NYPD, Giuliani would express zero condolences to the victim's family. Instead, he went on the offensive. "Maybe it is an altar boy," he began, seeming to refer to Dorshman as it. "It's some other situation that may justify, more closely, what the police officer did." Ironically, it turned out that Dorshman had in fact been an altar boy when he was younger. What's more, he had been one of the few black graduates of Giuliani's alma mater, Bishop Laughlin. But the facts behind Patrick Dorshman were secondary and easily dismissed when they challenged the dogma that justified Giuliani's dominion over New York City. It is true that, even during his second term, Giuliani's harsh, unfeeling responses to victims and critics of police violence could be colored by more humane-sounding rhetoric. As he showed in his first campaign for mayor in 1989, he's quite talented when it comes to bastardizing left-wing rhetoric to suit his needs. He did this often, and no doubt justified these deceptions as noble lies. At times, his rhetoric could be remarkable, switching from empathetic to contemptuous on the same day, sometimes within a few sentences. In an address to the UN General Assembly, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, when Islamophobia was surging, Rudy called for tolerance. "I know we're getting through to God," he said in his address. "We're using every liturgy that exists, and I know we're getting through to the same God. We may be doing it slightly different ways. God is known by many different names and many different traditions, but identified by one consistent feeling: love. Love for humanity, particularly love for our children. Love does eventually conquer hate." But in that same speech at the UN, he reiterated his pre-Enlightenment view of the world. Moral relativism, he insisted, doesn't have a place. In the mind of a religious authoritarian, we are either good or evil, and historical or societal forces play little or no part in dictating human behavior. According to Giuliani, those who practice terrorism, murdering or victimizing innocent civilians, lose any right to have their cause understood by decent people and lawful nations. On this issue, terrorism, the United Nations must draw a line. The era of moral relativism between those who practice or condone terrorism and those nations who stand up against it must end. Here we see again Giuliani's tyrannical nature. On one hand, he has draped himself in the mantle of compassion, but at the same time, he uses the shock and horror of the terrorist attack to alleviate a very questionable position, that people who resort to violence should be stripped of the right to have their cause understood. He has gone beyond condemnation of violence to profess an equally violent, if more subtle doctrine, that the powerful must not be challenged, whether by a mother of a child killed by the police or by the victims of the American Empire. It is a self-serving, somewhat sadistic ideology, and it has an analog in the teachings of the papacy, which maintains that, while loving us all, God has the unquestionable right to burn every sinner in an everlasting lake of fire. The inconsistencies that seem to surround Giuliani derive from a religious orthodoxy that also seems to exist in a state of constant contradiction. It is an orthodoxy that can oscillate dizzyingly in its rhetoric, but in the end, it is about claiming and establishing an unassailable authority. We don't need to be asking, what happened to America's mayor? The ranting and raving personal attorney for Donald Trump is not some new incarnation. It may have taken on a more grotesque outward appearance, but it still is, and always has been, America's mayor. Freedom is about authority. Orwellian, yes, but also straight out of Benito Mussolini's doctrine of fascism, where the Italian dictator wrote that, "If liberty is to be the attribute of living men and not of abstract dummies invented by individualistic liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty, and for the only liberty worth having, the liberty of the state and the individual within the state." We hardly need reminding that fascism, with its own apparent contradictions in claiming neither right nor left, originated right under the nose of the Vatican.
Why should a multimillionaire like yourself continue to reap these benefits?
Well, have you checked my books lately? I mean, do you know that I'm a multimillionaire? I mean, I'm trying to
Are you denying that you are?
No, I'm not. I went to the city. I said, I'm willing to invest a tremendous amount of money in this city, in this location. Now, people such as Ruth Messinger and others are opposed to the tax abatement.
In my judgment, Dick, the program has become a corporate welfare program. We are subsidizing developers like Mr. Trump. They make a huge profit. You've gotten something close to $160 million in tax benefits.
Did you read that in the Times? I mean, I'd like to find out why
Times said 168
Is that
million.
your source of information, or have you done this on your own? I mean, have you read an article and you've taken $160 million from
No, I've gone through the calculations. I understand how the abatement programs work
it's an
very
incorrect.
well.
In part 1 of this series, I argued that Rudy Giuliani's core ideology has remained consistent throughout his entire career. I wanted to set the record straight. He has always been the same person, contrary to what many media pundits like to believe. He has continuously been authoritarian and fascistic, whether after the 9/11 terrorist attack when the country rallied behind the flag, or during the January 6th insurrection when the American public felt more polarized. Giuliani serving as Donald Trump's personal lawyer and loyal surrogate may seem like a shock to those who remembered America's mayor, but the two share a resemblance in their astonishing electoral achievements. Rudy Giuliani first ran for mayor in 1989 and lost in the general election to David Dinkins, who became the first black mayor in the city's history. 4 years later, Giuliani rode a wave of white backlash to defeat Dinkins in a rematch. Likewise, Trump would harness racist sentiments to succeed the first African-American president. But this is merely one way that America's mayor's political tactics foreshadow those of the 45th president. A close look at Giuliani's re-election reveals how he wrote the playbook that Trump would later follow. In 1997, Giuliani won a second term as mayor of New York City, defeating Democrat Ruth Messinger by a wide margin. At first glance, the 1997 mayoral election seems distinctive mostly out of how decisive it was. In a city where Democrats outnumber Republicans 4-1, Messinger carried a mere 40% of the vote. She lost 4 of the 5 boroughs, including Manhattan, which she represented as borough president. Not only did white voters and men vote overwhelmingly for Giuliani, Messinger even lost the women's vote by 1 point. The 1997 mayoral election is often forgotten or brushed aside and not as closely examined as the 1993 election, which had closer margins between Democrat David Dinkins and Rudy Giuliani. But if we examine Giuliani's second victory closely, we find the more sordid foundations upon which his legacy was built. Had Ruth Messinger won, she would not only have been New York City's first woman to become mayor, she would also have been the most progressive in the city's history. During her youth, she was an anti-war activist and a member of Women's Strike for Peace, founded by Bella Abzug. She was also an early member of the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, long before they started claiming seats in the city council, the state legislature, and in Congress. Messinger had 20 years of public service as a city council member and borough president. During her time in the council, she fought for rent control for small businesses, eliminating tax abatements for wealthy developers, as well as divesting from apartheid South Africa. She was also instrumental in the passage of the first anti-discrimination law in the city to protect the rights of gays and lesbians in housing, employment, and public services. Always ahead of her time, Messinger ran for mayor supporting gay marriage during the 90s, 2 decades before it was legalized in the US. She bucked the bipartisan law and order crime policies that targeted people of color and opposed the death penalty when it was considered a liability. And during her time in the council, she was one of the few to vote against setting mandatory incarceration terms for non-violent drug offenses, when many Democrats today are embarrassed to have voted in favor of the now infamous 1994 Clinton crime bill. In addition to what it teaches us about Rudy Giuliani, the 1997 mayoral election also tells a compelling story of 2 competing visions of New York: a former teacher versus a former prosecutor, a Jewish woman with a history of organizing in the counterculture versus a Catholic man who was schooled in the tradition of the Counter-Reformation, a progressive who stood with the victims of police violence versus an authoritarian who unleashed disproportionate policing against communities of color. This is the overlooked tale of the 1997 New York City mayoral election. It is a story about how New York City gave fascism a second term. In order to get the best understanding of why New Yorkers elected Giuliani twice, I decided to reach out to Miss Messinger herself, and she was kind enough to give me the privilege of interviewing her about the 1997 mayoral race at her Upper West Side apartment. I will admit I was a bit intimidated as much as honored to meet with her one-to-one. She graduated magna cum laude from Radcliffe College in 1962. She is known as a detailed policy wonk and an obsessive reader, and I didn't want to say something insultingly ignorant. I was also aware of the fact that the apartment where we spoke had actually played a bit of a role in the 1997 mayoral election. 20 years earlier, in 1977, Messinger had hosted a release party for a convicted felon named John Hill, who was one of the inmates of the Attica prison uprising. In the 97 campaign, Giuliani seized on the event to frighten voters. He slammed Messinger, saying, "I'd like to know if she remembers giving a party to a convicted murderer or not." Giuliani would consistently portray Messinger as an out-of-touch radical from the 60s. One of the first things I asked Ruth was about this characterization, specifically her past membership in the Democratic Socialists of America, for which she was frequently attacked during the 97 election.
When I was attacked for it, it was a non-entity, and there were people who described themselves as democratic socialists. but it wasn't not a party, it was not a movement, and it was just, so it became something, you're correct here, that someone found in my past. I wasn't advertising it, not because I was ashamed of it, although I knew it wasn't going to help me, but because it wasn't a thing.
Messinger's recollection of her DSA connections and particularly its relevance to her '97 campaign shows how much politics has changed in New York City since the '90s. While it may have been a virtual non-entity with just a few thousand members during the 1997 election, today, after a huge boost from the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign, the DSA boasts a nationwide membership of almost 100,000. As of 2023, New York alone has 2 House members, 3 state senators, and 4 state assembly members who were endorsed by the DSA. These days, left-wing candidates in New York covet an endorsement from the Democratic Socialists of America. But for Messinger in the 1997 election, it was a liability. Another issue on which Messinger seems to have been too far ahead of her times, even for her own party, was the question of criminal justice reform. Long before the 2020 George Floyd uprising made Black Lives Matter a rallying cry for virtually the entire Democratic Party, Ruth was attacked, along with Mayor David Dinkins, for attending protests against police violence. In 1992, when a 24-year-old named Jose Kiko Garcia was shot and killed by the NYPD, Messinger and Dinkins met with the victim's family and marched in protest. In a preview of his upcoming run for mayor, Giuliani was quick to attack both Messinger and Dinkins for participating in a march. By pointing out Garcia's prior criminal record, Giuliani characterized the protest not as a call for police reform, but as the martyring of a former drug dealer. The image of Messinger and Dinkins with other black and brown demonstrators fueled the anxiety of white New Yorkers. Although crime did, in fact, decrease during Dinkins' term, the optics of protesting police violence fueled the perception that the sitting black mayor was on the side of criminals. And so, a year after the murder of Kiko Garcia, Giuliani would defeat Dinkins in the 1993 mayoral election. Giuliani's hard-nosed political posturing would have consequences beyond his electoral successes, metastasizing into a very dangerous mindset among the police. In the summer leading up to the 1997 election, there was the case of Abner Louima, a Haitian American who was kicked, beaten, and sodomized by members of the NYPD. According to Louima, while the police were torturing him, one of the officers said, "You have to learn to respect police officers. David Dinkins is no longer in power. It's Giuliani time. You don't have a black mayor anymore." 2 weeks after Louima's torture by the police and against the wishes of some of her campaign advisors, Ruth used the phrase Giuliani time in a speech delivered in the neighborhood of East Flatbush, the place where Rudy was born. Giuliani time is a time when it's out of fashion to care about the poor and homeless. Unemployment is at depression levels in some boroughs and neighborhoods. It's Giuliani time. Some 90,000 children will be forced to go to schools in closets and stairwells and locker rooms and bathrooms. It's Giuliani time. And what did they chant when they beat and brutalized Abner Louima? It's Giuliani time. Why did they chant his name? Why? Because Giuliani time is a time of cold shoulders and hard hearts. Messinger's effort to make Louima an issue in the election failed to win hearts and minds, with one poll showing that 52% of respondents believed that his case was merely an isolated incident. The New York Post would even write that Giuliani time was preferable to Dinkins' time.
Yes, but I think when it comes to candidates for office, it's still like a horror show to imagine criticizing the police.
Yeah.
But it was clear to me that, you can't have an unaccountable police department. And then in the Louima case, it was just dramatic. And the fact that that case did not sort of blow up police behavior and sort of lead to some embarrassment for the mayor remains, I think a very sad comment on what people are willing to believe or not believe and what they're willing to accept as abuse and mistreatment of people who are other than them.
Because crime had continued to go down under Giuliani, white New Yorkers didn't want to hear how their protectors were also orchestrating a terror campaign against black and brown residents. The city did finally feel safer and cleaner for some, but not all. This perception would lead to a gotcha question directed at Messinger in her first debate with Giuliani. When she was asked, "Did the quality of life improve for you under Giuliani's first term?" Messinger flatly declared no. Notwithstanding the straightforwardness of her answer, Messinger's denial was viewed as disingenuous. When so many people had bought into Giuliani's narrative, even the liberal New York Times felt Messinger's answer was insincere.
In retrospect, it would have been much better to provide a nuanced answer to that question. For some people, the quality of life is much better. They're less anxious about things. They see crime statistics. But for other people, things have not changed. Yeah. But people couldn't understand that I was like answering with a perspective on the whole city.
Clearly, there are many factors that go into what we call the quality of life. But in a political campaign where for many white New Yorkers, the single issue of crime overshadowed everything else, it's hard to say whether a more nuanced response would have worked. Messinger's no answer at the debate was later cited by the Times as a reason why they finally chose to endorse Rudy Giuliani. Then, as now, the New York Times carried a lot of weight in the city. Messinger's loss of its endorsement was a serious blow to her campaign.
The Times' response to the campaign was extremely disappointing to me. I'm still somebody who reads the New York Times cover to cover every single day in the print edition. And it was one thing for unions or Sharpton or even the tabloids to sort of focus on what he had done. I thought the Times failed to bring any kind of discretion or high-level examination to looking at the city. And I don't think I handled that question well, because it is true that for people who were already in positions of comfort and power, yes, the city felt safer. They had big statistics on crime reduction, and so they felt like things are better. I don't know when, but shortly after I won the primary, and all of the people in my campaign sat me down and asked me if I understood that I was going to lose. Yeah. And I said, so let's just keep fighting. And I think they all thought that somehow I would reduce my efforts. Since I wasn't going to win anyways, like, why keep up this the pace of campaigning and the attacks? And I was like, that's what I'm in this for. But I also did think that at some point in those months leading up to November, that there would be some parts of the New York Times that would say, let's try to take an objective look on what he has or hasn't done. Let's look at some of these issues that she's raising and recognize that indeed they haven't gotten better in the last 4 years.
Despite her own campaign's calculations following the primary, Messinger's loss to Giuliani was not inevitable, certainly not at the start. It was true that Giuliani had a massive fundraising advantage driven by donations from big real estate. But Democrats, then as now, outnumbered Republicans 4-1 in New York City. It was true that many white voters felt safer, but Giuliani's popularity was certainly not unassailable. A year before the election in 1996, his approval hovered around a modest 43%. And Messinger was extremely popular in Manhattan. She was elected as borough president in 1989 with 83% of the vote and was re-elected with similar margins. The decisive weakness in her campaign against Giuliani was her lack of institutional support from traditional Democratic leaders and groups. Take, for example, the unions. Several of the city's biggest ones went for Giuliani. These included some fairly progressive ones such as the Healthcare Union SEIU 1199 and the UFT Teachers Union, both of which endorsed Giuliani over Messinger. On other fronts, Democrats from Queensboro President Claire Shulman to Congress members Floyd Flake and Adolphus Towns also backed Giuliani. In one of the most astonishing instances, even gay rights groups like the Stonewall Democratic Club gave their endorsement not to their own party's candidate, but to the mayor who refused to march at gay pride parades and who denied federally mandated assistance to people with HIV and AIDS. So why would these unions, Democratic politicians, and groups side with the Republican Giuliani?
That when I made the decision to run against him, I expected not overwhelming support, but some different attitudes, both from the press and from the labor movement, than I got. And in both of those instances, I think it's because a combination of they read the numbers, like defeating him was unlikely, and that he would punish people. And he would have punished them. And so it's a challenge again for labor. Labor, particularly in New York City, those unions that you mentioned, all do all of their labor negotiations with the mayor.
Right, yeah.
So they have to be inclined to support the person who's in power already and the person whom they think is going to win. Yeah. And so they are hesitant to support challengers.
Messinger was also unable to consolidate support from her main opponent in the Democratic primary, Al Sharpton. After losing to Messinger, Sharpton waited until the middle of October before finally announcing his support. It was not only late in coming, it was a little more than a tacit endorsement. Sharpton merely called Messinger the best alternative of the candidates that are in the field.
And I'm not going to criticize this. I might be sad about it, but when you have a movement, when you have a set of issues, when you have a constituency, which Sharpton has a constituency similar to the unions having a constituency, so you have to think about what's best for them. And if you just think about this totally objectively, they have two choices. Obviously, they have thousands of choices, but there are two choices. Go with the candidate who's most likely to work on our issues, but risk defeat, and then being in trouble with a bullying and I think prone to racism mayor, or cozy up to that mayor who's likely to be reelected, and will be in good standing because it will look as if we helped him. He'll have to owe us something. That's the way politics is. And to be honest with you, if you're Al Sharpton and you say, or a union, and you say, okay, we're not going to support her because she's not likely to win, and we'll be bullied, and we would be hurting our constituency. And if we support the other guy and she wins anyway, she's going to do almost everything we want because she's in our corner.
This cynical yet pragmatic approach still remains an issue in New York politics. While left-wing groups like the Working Families Party or the Democratic Socialists of America have the luxury to endorse whomever they wish, unions remain sensitive to the political repercussions if they do not endorse the eventual winner. In the 2018 gubernatorial primary, for instance, when the Working Families Party chose to endorse Cynthia Nixon, the incumbent Andrew Cuomo reportedly threatened, "If unions or anyone give money to any of these groups, they can lose my number." The intimidation worked, and the unions backed away from their alignment with the Working Families Party and chose to endorse Cuomo. It is this type of bullying that gets you ahead in New York, and Giuliani was a master of the craft. In the 1997 race, there was genuine fear of Giuliani's retribution as the mayor brazenly threatened unions and the press to fall in line. As Messinger herself indicates, the abandonment by groups that ordinarily would have been expected to back a Democrat stemmed less from a lack of genuine support and much more from a subdued conviction that Giuliani was sure to win. We can call it pragmatic despair. But again, Giuliani's success was not as inevitable as people seem to think. Giuliani may have maximized his toughen crime image, but there is evidence that Messinger's platform had a wider appeal with the electorate. In one poll, when asked to single out one or two issues they felt most important for the next mayor to address, 60% of respondents said improving education and schools, while 40% said it was fighting crime. While Giuliani, the former prosecutor, was seen as the best candidate on the issue of crime, Messinger, a former school teacher, had the advantage when it came to education. Not surprisingly, Messinger tried to capitalize on this advantage by highlighting many of the problems afflicting New York City schools. One issue in particular was the lack of classroom space, which had forced a quarter of the city's schools to conduct lessons in bathrooms, offices, cafeterias, or hallways. Messinger tried to call attention to this very real crisis with a campaign ad featuring a photo of students studying near urinal stalls. The shocking image should have sparked outrage, but it was cravenly dismissed by the media. Like the unions that supported Giuliani out of fear, the press was concerned about losing access to the mayor. They were not going to risk being excluded from City Hall by going after the mayor's failed stewardship of the city's public schools.
Basically because the press would not investigate the allegations. So I made the allegation, which was true. I had people from inside the schools to back me up. Giuliani denied it, his education leaders denied it, and the press basically took his word for it. One of the issues for that whole campaign, and it continues to be an issue, although maybe people are learning things, and there are lots more forms of media right now, but Giuliani, among Giuliani's characteristics was to bully the press.
Of course, yeah.
And he did that very well, and the press was quite bullied. There's a convention in New York City, which is odd but not terrible, in which the reporters who cover city government have a room in City Hall. And they operate out of that room. And you can see, well, that's logical. They're not going to come down every day from their newspaper, and if they did, where would they hang out? On the other hand, it creates a slightly too cozy atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a reporter in that room, and there are 3 or 4 major dailies, there were 4 major dailies at that point, everybody's watching everybody else. Like, I'm not going to cover something that no one else is covering, but I'm going to cover things that I want to be first, but I don't want to be too far out there. So the press, in a sense, was a limit on itself, not to go too far. And then at press conferences, Giuliani insulted members of the press often. Right. Would say, like, I don't want you at this press conference because I don't like what your newspaper wrote about me yesterday. Yeah. And so that made the fact that I ended up, I wasn't like I was looking for an issue that was that dramatic, but that issue came to me and it was really appalling. Mm-hmm. And it was more appalling that the press basically would not take it seriously.
Fear of getting barred from that room in City Hall caused no less than the New York Times to cow to Giuliani's tactics. In an article titled "How Not to Run a Campaign," a reporter trivialized Messinger's call for school reform and accused her of manufacturing an illustration of school overcrowding that is worse than anything in the city's system. Today, now that Rudy Giuliani has fallen from grace, the liberal press is eager to fire off cheap shots in his direction. It is a bit dismaying to recall how many of these same outlets lined up behind him when he was at the peak of his power, when there was a real chance to take him down. Maureen Dowd of the New York Times, at the onset of the Democratic primary in 1997, wrote that it was unfathomable to think of any of the Democratic candidates for mayor actually being mayor. David Brooks, who also now writes for the Times, wrote a month before the election in the Weekly Standard that Messinger was conducting the most lifeless, vacuous Democratic campaign in the city's history, maybe in the history of the world. Richard Cohen of the Washington Post, who wrote in 2016 that dislike of Clinton is so palpable that has become akin to prejudice, had no trouble in 1997 saying that Ruth Messinger had a radio face in the television era. As I pointed out in part 1 of this series, Rudy Giuliani has always been the same. In his first term, he cut the homeless services budget by 75%. He denied food stamps to 500,000 New Yorkers when the federal program didn't actually cost the city a cent. His policing tactics against people of color were so unbridled that his black deputy mayor, Rudy Washington, had to be issued a police identification badge to help him through the numerous times he was stopped and frisked. But because crime in the city had gone down and the streets were safer for the privileged, nothing else really mattered. New York was given a clear choice between two competing visions, and the city chose to re-elect Rudy Giuliani with 57% of the vote. In 1997, authoritarianism defeated progressivism. As I mentioned earlier, the story of Rudy Giuliani versus Ruth Messinger is one of two competing visions of New York. In fact, these stark differences have long played a part in the city's history. On one hand, New York can lay claim to the tradition of Bill the Butcher and Boss Tweed. The city is also the setting of the 1863 draft riots when the deadliest street violence and lynching in the nation's history took place. And Madison Square Garden, in the heart of Manhattan, is where, in 1939, the largest Nazi rally in America was hosted. Giuliani, the good Catholic boy from Brooklyn, fits neatly into the pantheon of right-wingers hailing from New York. He is right up there with Queens native Donald Trump, Manhattanite William F. Buckley, and the Bronx-born Roy Cohn, who played an instrumental role in Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist witch hunt. On the other hand, New York can boast a robust counter-tradition that has consistently resisted the viciousness of the right and proved itself capable of taking its most brutal punches. There has been numerous tough-as-nails underdogs who continue to inspire by their courageous fight to make life better, for everyone, not just the privileged few. New York is the birthplace of Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman elected to Congress. Known as Fighting Shirley, Chisholm was instrumental in expanding child welfare and food stamp programs, in addition to her vocal opposition to the Vietnam War. Brooklyn was also where Elizabeth Holtzman was elected as the youngest woman to Congress at age 31 in 1972. Labeled by the media as Liz the Lion Killer, she led the charge against Richard Nixon by being one of the first members of Congress to support impeachment proceedings during Watergate. Manhattan is home to working-class champions like Bella Abzug. Not to be outdone when it comes to nicknames, Battling Bella was a feminist icon in the House of Representatives. She introduced the first federal gay rights bill in 1974 and fought relentlessly for the Equal Rights Amendment for women. A common denominator among many of these leading left-wing figures is the working-class experience of the descendants of Jewish immigrants seeking a new and more just world. Whether it is Abzug, Holtzman, or to throw in a more familiar name, the Brooklyn-born Bernie Sanders, who came from the same generation. New York may be the city of Rudy Giuliani, but it is also the city of Ruth Messinger. While Giuliani and the media declared his 1997 win a landslide, his margin of victory does not tell the full story. In fact, the total of Giuliani's winning vote count was the lowest in a two-person mayoral race in 74 years. And it represented a decrease of 172,000 votes from his first win 4 years earlier, a 22% drop. And while 76% of white voters went for Giuliani, 79% of black voters backed Messinger. Clearly, Giuliani's appeal was not absolute, and the claim that things had improved during his first term must also be taken with a grain of salt. For the quality of life had not, in fact, improved for everyone at the time. So the reality is that Giuliani was re-elected with a small mandate in a divided city. Meaning, Ruth Messinger could have won if there had been the necessary field operation provided by unions, Democratic clubs, as well as the press to increase turnout. The liberal press and Democrats can pretend that they always opposed Giuliani, but not all of our memories are as short as they would like. They cowed when Giuliani was at the peak of his power and did not choose to fight him when it mattered most. But Ruth Messinger did. She burned her political bridges in order to stand up for the poor, public school children, and the victims of police violence. Even when she knew it was a losing cause, Messinger held fast in an idealistic faith that one's convictions are always worth fighting for, until the bitter end. With so much of the political system running on cynicism, or what I've called pragmatic despair, it takes a special level of courage to be willing to stand alone for what is just. Many of Ruth's positions may have been unpopular then, but as she said in her closing remarks at the final debate against Giuliani, "I will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions."
So there was a columnist on this issue of school overcrowding. I said, like, look, you can't get in the school and I can't get in the school, so I can't get in with a camera. But just come to this place in the city where the parents and kids are going to testify at the press conference at some risk to themselves. They're going to say what's happening inside the school. So the columnists came. Now, to be fair, about half the people that had told me they would come to testify at the press conference didn't come because they were scared. And they would have been on camera. But some certainly did.
Where was it, by the way, the school?
In Queens. And described what was happening. So it was a Queens audience, and they were scared, and they were like, yes, but this is what happened. That columnist chose to write a column about how the people that had promised to come to my press conference didn't come. So he made me look like an idiot about the cause, but it's just like, I don't know, she said they would be 12, I don't remember, and I don't going to look myself, but it was like, oh, there were supposed to be a gaggle of people, and there were only a few people, and so she's not a popular candidate, etc. Anyway, I only tell you this story to say that several months, probably a year after the election, unsolicited, I got a handwritten note. Oh, I think I wrote the columnist after that appeared and said, like, okay, you don't have to believe the issue, but that was really a nasty column. And he didn't answer. And a year later, I got a note from him, which I still have in this drawer. Says, you were right, I was wrong. And he signed it.
April 2nd, 1934. Harold Hall, a milkman in East Harlem, New York, enters an apartment on East 96th Street for a routine collection of payments from his customers. As he sets foot inside the building, two thugs emerge out of the shadows behind the stairwell. They surround Mr. Hall. "You know what it is," says one, thrusting a pistol into Mr. Hall's stomach. The two burglars proceed to steal $128 out of Hall's pockets. But they were not finished. The burglar with the pistol pinned the milkman down and yanked his pants off, leaving him half naked with his hands and feet bound together. Hog-tied and facing the wall, the milkman was saved at the last minute when a police officer arrived on the scene, ordering the two burglars to throw them up. Although one of the robbers escaped, the policeman managed to nab the thug with the pistol. His name was Harold Giuliani, a failed amateur boxer who channeled his taste for violence into petty crime. After his arrest, Harold Giuliani was taken to the city's Department of Hospitals for an evaluation. Quick-tempered and prone to lashing out violently, he was deemed pathological in nature, to an extent where he has failed to consider the feelings and rights of others. For his participation in the armed robbery of the milkman, Harold Giuliani was sent to the notorious Sing Sing prison. Released from incarceration 14 years later, Harold went back to his life of crime, working as a collection agent or muscle for a loan shark operation. One afternoon, a man pleaded with Harold for an extra week to pay off his debts. Harold agreed, but not before hitting the man in the face with a baseball bat so hard it sent him flying back several feet. "Don't be late again," Giuliani warned. Decades later, in 1981, just days before his son Rudy was to be confirmed as the youngest associate attorney general in American history, Harold Giuliani died from prostate cancer. Harold's son mourned him, calling his father's death as one of the most painful events of his life. Rudy Giuliani would later say, "My father was one of my heroes because he had such a tremendous ability to control, overcome, fear." March 11, 2000. At the New York Hilton Hotel in Midtown, the city's press corps and politicians all gathered for the annual Inner Circle dinner. A near 100-year tradition dating back to the era of Tammany Hall, the Inner Circle is a black-tie gala for the city's power brokers. The scene is similar to the more familiar White House Correspondents' Dinner, where journalists and DC insiders mingle with one another for a night of satirical speeches, culminating with a response from the US President himself. But in keeping with the city's grittier image, the mayor of New York's contribution to the amateur comedy at the Inner Circle is much more vulgar and lowbrow than the tame stand-up routine a president might give at a correspondence dinner.
The Inner Circle, it's a strange tradition in my view where reporters who cover City Hall or have some connections to New York City reporting, they do skits and they lampoon the mayor and the political scene, and then the mayor does a response skit. It's kind of like the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and it raises money for charity, though the accountability of that money is really in question. And so it's this long-running tradition, which, most people think is harmless. I myself think it's somewhat unethical, and I've written about this before. I don't think reporters should be coming together to laugh and party with people they cover. I think there should be more distance. But it's a long-time tradition, and certainly Giuliani and was very notorious for cross-dressing in his skit.
Rudy's grand performance began with his entry onto the stage as a patient in a psychiatrist's office. His friend Elliot Cucker, acting as the doctor, asked Rudy about his dreams. The mayor then told him that he was having a really hot fantasy about dating 3 New York City journalists at the same time, to which Cucker responded, "Ah, so you're a masochist," and the crowd erupted in laughter. "My main problem is with anger," Rudy said as the skit continued. "I'm just so angry." "Anything in particular?" asked Cucker. "Yes, the goddamn press," Rudy shouted to the murmuration of nervous giggles from the audience. "I'm not paranoid, I just don't trust anybody," he proceeded to say. "Rudy, you can trust me," Cucker reassured. "You're right," the mayor answered. "Howard Schaefer gave me your police files." The veil of humor could not hide the eerie sense of recognition from the mayor of New York of his own corruption, keeping illegal tabs of even his closest companions with the help of Police Commissioner Howard Schaefer. The other jokes Rudy told that evening were equally awkward, as he quipped about having extramarital affairs, just as he was going through a very public separation from his second wife after cheating on her with his much younger press secretary. Although it is doubtful that the audience made the connection, Rudy's dramatized confession of anger and paranoia also came painfully close to the very real psychiatric assessment of his own father. As the mayor's skit continued, a screen behind the stage lit up with a montage of Rudy's insane antics. The showcase included scenes of him dressed up as the Beast from Beauty and the Beast. There were also scenes of him berating cab drivers and eating Henry Kissinger's lunch. And most famously, it treated the audience to Rudy in drag, with Donald Trump sniffing his blouse. As the lights came back up, Giuliani declared that he enjoyed dressing up as different characters not because he had multiple personalities, but because he had a big personality. And the performance concluded with him dancing with the cast of Saturday Night Fever. Rudy was a true star at the Inner Circle dinner. But what the political elites found entertaining and humorous about a mayor who is always angry and paranoid had very real ramifications for the rest of New York City. For those working class residents who couldn't afford a $400 a plate at the Hilton Hotel, Rudy Giuliani's mayoralty was a police state, and the impact of his authoritarian administration would reverberate soon after the Inner Circle dinner. Just 5 days later, all the laughter stopped when the NYPD murdered another young black man, the 26-year-old Patrick Dorshmond. Working class New Yorkers, particularly black and brown residents, had had enough. 3 unarmed black men were already killed by the NYPD in the previous 13 months. Rudy's poll numbers plummeted, as he gave no apology for the murder of Dorshmond and even went as far as attacking the murdered man's character as well as that of his family and girlfriend. City Hall was met with daily protests against the police state. A racial justice movement emerged in New York that would not be matched in scale or intensity until 20 years later during the peak of the George Floyd movement. In all likelihood, this was to be Rudy's legacy. A sad, cynical man that New Yorkers couldn't wait to boot off the stage, as polls projected Democrat Mark Green ready to succeed the term-limited mayor. And perhaps even Rudy Giuliani was looking forward to the respite. His very public and messy separation from his wife had forced him to move out of Gracie Mansion. A living caricature of a husband going through a divorce, the mayor of America's largest city was now reduced to couch surfing in the apartment of his friend Howard Koppel on the Upper East Side. In the last few months of his final term, the absurdity of his personal life made Rudy a laughingstock even in the eyes of the usually friendly New York Post. It all looked like the curtain was falling on the ignominious career of another mediocre New York City mayor. Perhaps he would have been remembered as a mere footnote in history. Until... "9/11 was literally supposed to be the day when New Yorkers moved on from Rudy Giuliani. It was primary election day when voters would nominate a replacement for the incumbent. But instead, 9/11 was the day America's mayor was born. Rudy's finest hour. The camera captured him within the smoke and ash, looking determined, purposeful, and in control. And just the day after, he played the father figure comforting an entire nation. Rudy Giuliani became the most beloved politician in the country, if not the entire world."
There are many critics of Giuliani in the post-9/11 period, and there are many people aware of his failures around Amadou Diallo and others, but the hero narrative was so strong, it could swamp everything. And you had a politician who, in those first few years after September 11th, was close to untouchable, and that's where his presidential bid comes from. There's no Rudy for president without 9/11. It just would not happen.
But Giuliani was not the great hero of 9/11. He in fact bore a direct responsibility for the disorderly nature of the rescue operation. More lives could have been saved from the devastating terrorist attack on that fateful day, but New York's greatest tragedy was made worse due to the inaction and indifference from its own mayor. Throughout his 2 terms as mayor, Giuliani had been asked repeatedly to upgrade the radios that the New York City firefighters relied upon for communication. He refused, and as a result, on the morning of 9/11, many first responders inside the Twin Towers were unable to receive the necessary evacuation orders that were being sent. Unaware of the impending danger due to the outdated equipment, dozens, if not hundreds of firefighters who might have been able to escape perished when the towers collapsed. A more reproachable blunder made by Giuliani was his decision to place the city's emergency command center at Building 7 of the World Trade Center. Prior to 9/11, the mayor had been warned that the downtown financial district was a likely target for a terrorist attack, and he was advised to put the city's command center for large-scale disasters in a less densely populated area in Brooklyn. But Rudy insisted that he wanted it to be within walking distance to his office in City Hall and placed the command center at what would later be known as Ground Zero. Without the city's specialized command center, the NYPD and the FDNY lacked the centralized uniformed communication it needed to respond more effectively. As the 9/11 Commission report stated, a working command center could have limited the redundancy of police and firefighters checking the same floor over and over again, reducing the number of first responders needed to risk their lives. The 9/11 Commission also concluded that the command center would have had access to ongoing reports from police helicopters. These reports would have included the critical warning that the South Tower was about to collapse 9 minutes before it did. When the day was over, Rudy finally returned home to the apartment of his friend Howard Koppel at around 2:30 a.m. Sitting in the living room, he watched the towers collapse for the first time on a television screen. Perhaps he felt guilt, maybe he was in sorrow, but it is beyond a doubt that Rudy knew full well of the consequences of his actions. After all, he spent the day of 9/11 wandering around aimlessly because he lacked a command center to coordinate the rescue operation. Deep down, Rudy knew that he failed New York. Unable to sleep, he turned off the television. Searching for answers, he pulled out a book about another man who led his nation during another great disaster. A man Rudy had always worshipped. And so, in the middle of the night, Giuliani began to read a biography of Winston Churchill. He turned to the chapters about Churchill becoming prime minister in 1940. He contemplated how Britain's most famous prime minister cemented his place in history during the darkest hour. It must have been an opportunity for Giuliani to think about his own future. We can speculate that, right after 9/11, before all the bodies were even found, Rudy was already devising a way to recast his legacy as America's Churchill. No stranger to feuds with the media, Giuliani recognized how the British press at the time also ridiculed Winston Churchill, and he admired the Prime Minister's stubbornness, which Rudy saw as principled leadership. In an interview with the British Telegraph, the mayor of New York would say that he admired Churchill because he never said, "I don't know what to do," or "I'm lost." He walked out with a direction, a purpose, even if he had to fake it. And so, even with his failures over the location of the command center or the outdated firefighters' radios, fake it is exactly what Rudy decided to do. Rudy Giuliani would go on to reference Winston Churchill in various speeches and interviews. In addition to reading Churchill's biography written by British politician Roy Jenkins in the night after 9/11, Rudy also enjoyed 5 Days in London, May 1940, written by the self-described reactionary John Lukács. And Lukács' book became a bestseller soon after it was touted by Rudy. The press also made the comparisons between Churchill and Giuliani. The Washington Post called Rudy Winston Churchill in a Yankee cap. Newsweek declared Rudy as our Winston Churchill, walking the rubble, calming and inspiring his heartbroken but defiant people. In Times Person of the Year article, even Giuliani's excessive use of the police force against petty crime in New York City was spun into yet another quality of resembling Churchill. Though they may have played down the less admirable implications, the media was not wrong to highlight the Churchillian characteristics of Rudy Giuliani. There are, in fact, striking parallels between America's mayor and Britain's most beloved prime minister. In addition to their chronic drinking habits, both men failed miserably during their respective political careers. But both Churchill and Giuliani could use their rhetorical skills to mask their incompetence as leaders and comfort their constituents. For those with just a general sense of history of World War II, Winston Churchill may seem like the great hero who saved his country by defeating Nazi Germany. But in reality, Britain survived not because of, but in spite of, Churchill's incompetence. Even before the Second World War, Churchill's military leadership often led to disaster. Most famously when he oversaw one of Britain's most spectacular military failures with the Gallipoli campaign during the First World War. As Prime Minister, he devised ludicrous plans against all his advisors that included attacking the neutral state of Norway. Churchill was responsible for the massacres of partisan resistance fighters in Greece, ensuring the post-war takeover of the country by a right-wing dictatorship. He was drunk on power as he was on scotch, best evidenced by his advocacy of an all-out attack on the Soviet Union after Germany's defeat. When the world had already seen so much death and destruction, Churchill wanted more. And perhaps his greatest sin as Prime Minister was his inaction during the Bengal famine of 1943, which left 3 million dead. But the man who claimed to hate Indians and called them a beastly people with a beastly religion probably never lost much sleep over it. Nevertheless, mainstream portrayals and Oscar-winning films have mythologized Churchill into a larger-than-life hero. His surly nature and aura of self-importance have transmogrified into the enduring habits of a shrewd and an indomitable leader. His entire legacy is owed to chance. As William Shakespeare wrote in Twelfth Night, "Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them." And Churchill had greatness thrust upon him. The actual practice of governing matters little to the public's memory. For Churchill, what people heard and later remembered were the rousing speeches after Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain. And just as the Bengal famine or murdering anti-fascist resistance fighters doesn't matter when it comes to the mainstream discourse of Churchill, the selfish move of the command center to Building 7 or ignoring the FDNY's repeated requests for new radios didn't matter to the public's newfound admiration for Giuliani right after 9/11.
Giuliani genuinely was a great performer in that period. He nailed the symbolic aspects of being mayor, the leader in wartime. He was good at it. George Pataki was governor and no one cared. It was the Rudy show. So you can't sell him short there. And that charisma and also ability to be a successful media figure, which was true of Rudy going back to the 1980s. Remember, he rises to power as the U.S. attorney for the Southern District, and he does it, yes, because he's a good prosecutor, but really he's a media figure. You know, he's somebody who's charming the press. He's leaking aspects of the case to favorite reporters. He's creating this image for himself as the white knight who's cleaning up the city. So after 9/11, he's very good at it, and that's very real, and you can't discount that. And the dark side of that is if you have someone who is very charismatic, it can overshadow all the real tangible failures, all the policy failures, the failures of decision making. So on September 13th, there could be a journalist saying, well, wait a second, you've the EMS headquarters in the World Trade Center. Wait a second, the radios don't work. It doesn't matter. People are terrified. They're grieving. They are desperate for a leader.
In the post-9/11 political climate of jingoism mixed with fear, the American populace was incapable of critical thinking and objective evaluation of Giuliani's handling of the disaster. Like Churchill, Giuliani did not achieve greatness but had it thrust upon him. As the political scientist Benedict Anderson wrote in the seminal book Imagined Communities, it is the magic of nationalism to turn chance into destiny.
Jingoism and fear together definitely are a very powerful cocktail, and you see this throughout American history. It didn't start with 9/11, and that certainly propels Bush and Giuliani. I think they were charismatic leaders. You know, Bush had his, Bush looked like a president, right? Mm-hmm. How people imagine a president should look. He was a hokey guy who was prone to misspeaking, but at the same time, he had this gravitas to him that certainly Donald Trump doesn't have. And then Giuliani was a genuine media creature who understood the New York and national media very well, and had been in the trenches of it for decades. So he was ready to seize the opportunity. But jingoism and fear are bigger, and it was an attack unlike any other in American history, and just sort of its spectacular insanity, right? This idea these towers are hit by planes and then collapse on live television. Mm-hmm. I was in New York at the time. I was young, and it was you couldn't fathom it. It was so frightening and so surreal that really did trigger this wave of jingoism, of fierce nationalism that define politics for the next decade.
The mayor of New York City, Rudolph Giuliani.
Grazie. God bless you, Rudy. I can't see the live. God bless you, Rudy. God bless you, Rudy.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Rudy! Get over here, Rudy! We're having a wonderful time. We're really enjoying ourselves. Thank you. Such a great turnout.
If you hear or see anything later on about New York, you'll know my credentials are in good order. Here's what you do domestically. You take Don Imus's advice, and you tell Liz Tommy Thompson and Tom Ridge, good try, nice going, we'll see you later. And in charge of the whole domestic thing, you put Rudolph Giuliani, an Italian from Brooklyn, okay? Now, okay. All right.
When unexpected disasters strike fear into the general public, the desperation for leadership allows authoritarians like Rudy Giuliani to become popular. His soaring popularity right after 9/11 is not a lesson in effective governance. Rather, it reminds us how otherwise incompetent politicians can suddenly and undeservedly become national heroes in moments of uncertainty and fear. This meteoric rise in admiration and esteem often has little to do with effective policies or inspired actions. It is a product of circumstance, to be sure, but it also requires a person who knows how to capitalize on the opportunity disaster brings. And what takes place is similar to the rally around the flag effect, or what I call the Churchill Complex. It is a collective madness of the general populace desperate for a comforting leader at a time of panic and confusion. Even when the leader is incompetent or unfit, the Churchill Complex inhibits critical thinking skills and translates into hysterical and unquestionable admiration for those in power. History is riddled with instances of political leaders taking advantage of the population suffering from the Churchill Complex. Take, for instance, another famous British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. At the end of her first term, the Iron Lady faced a likely defeat in her bid for re-election. Hovering at the 20-30% range, her polling was abysmal at the beginning of 1982. But then in April, Argentina unexpectedly invaded the Falkland Islands, and the British public turned to their unpopular prime minister to save them. Arguably, there was nothing remarkable or particularly brilliant about Thatcher's handling of the war, as it was a one-sided conflict between one great European powerhouse to a much poorer Latin American country. Nevertheless, after the British defeated the Argentinians in a decisive victory, Thatcher's poll numbers skyrocketed and she won by a landslide in the 1983 election. A much more recent example comes from Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky. Both men saw their previously low approval ratings soar into positive territory immediately after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. With the onset of the war, the people united around their leaders in jingoistic fervor. This is all in spite of Putin leaving his own nation in diplomatic and economic isolation from the rest of the world, and Zelensky continuously ignoring the prediction from intelligence briefings that Russia would invade just before the war. If we look at the US, we find only two presidents after World War II who have achieved similarly high approval ratings, near 90%, and both of them from the Bush dynasty. George Bush Sr. saw his numbers climb after Iraq's surprise invasion of Kuwait, and Bush Jr. rode the same wave of nationalism as Giuliani did after 9/11, though he rather famously ignored the warnings that Al-Qaeda was planning an attack on US soil.
9/11 itself was a security failure. Why wasn't the Bush administration prepared for Saudi terrorists to hijack planes? How'd they so easily get on the planes? 9/11 doesn't happen if you just have security at the airport. And that's all. You don't have to wage two wars. You just have to keep terrorists from getting into cockpits, like locked cockpits. And you can have what we have today, metal detectors and TSA. You do that, we accept those trade-offs. You don't need two catastrophic wars with hundreds of thousands dead overseas.
The crises that can temporarily bestow an aurora of greatness on politicians are not limited to man-made catastrophes like war or terrorism. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic in 2020, Andrew Cuomo became one of the most popular politicians in the country. The then New York governor held almost daily press conferences which he rolled out slick graphics and other props to reassure the public that he and his team were on top of things. More than their actual substance, it was the regularity of these presentations that gave him the appearance of a confident, capable authority. Seduced by the performance, celebrities like Trevor Noah and Ellen DeGeneres were soon swooning over the governor and calling themselves Cuomo-sexuals.
You call yourself a Cuomo-sexual, and I agree with you. I feel like I'm a Cuomo-sexual too.
And we had Chelsea Handler on yesterday, who has admitted to having a significant crush on you.
We were so dehydrated for real leadership that when he came on the scene, looking like this big Italian hunk, I was like, oh my, he's like, wear a mask. I'm like, I'll wear a mask. I'll put a mask on every part of my body. I want to flatten your curve.
The effect of the pandemic briefings led to serious discussions within Democratic circles and the liberal media about replacing Joe Biden with Cuomo as the party leader. And to ratify his newly forged image as the man with the answers in a time of crisis, Cuomo published a book entitled Leadership Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic. With his own bestseller, Cuomo was following the footsteps of Giuliani's own memoir written after 9/11, similarly titled Leadership. And just like Giuliani, Andrew Cuomo also made references to Winston Churchill. And the media, including the Washington Post, Boston Globe, CNBC, all made comparisons with Churchill and Cuomo. Ross Barkan, the author of The Prince, Andrew Cuomo, Coronavirus, and the Fall of New York, also sees similarities between Cuomo and Giuliani.
Many parallels. It was really eerie to see Cuomo's standing rise in the early days of COVID because it was very reminiscent of Giuliani's rise, because each of them were benefiting from the same dynamic, which was terror and fear, and the ability of both of them to speak calmly and coherently and build effective presences in the media. Cuomo is not known as a charismatic, strong man in the way Giuliani had been. Certainly Cuomo was a strong man. He'd been governor at that point for a decade. He had been the most powerful governor in New York since Nelson Rockefeller. He was feared, but he was never someone who was overwhelmingly popular. He was someone, in fact, who had been scandal scarred. His top aide, someone who's like a brother to him, went to prison on a corruption charge. He'd had real failures in government, but because it is hard to defeat governors, and he was very good at raising money and very good at playing politics in the state. He's someone who understood the levers of power very well. You weren't going to dethrone him, but COVID took it to a different level. He went from this creature of a political machine of his own making to a national hero. And as I sitting there as a journalist and a writer who'd followed him for a long time and seen how New York was really failing to contain COVID and then racking up more deaths than anywhere else in the United States at the time, I was very confused. I'm like, wait a second, nothing is going well in New York. Why is Cuomo a hero? And no one could really point to anything tangible. They would say, well, he's comforting people. He's on TV every day. I mean, he benefited from a very similar dynamic to Giuliani, which was when people are scared, they do look for comfort. They go to television and they listen to their leaders. And if you're good enough, if you cross a certain threshold, which Trump could not cross because Trump is Trump, you really can develop a mass following. Giuliani did it. And Cuomo, in these COVID briefings every day, had this captive audience, people staying indoors, scared for their lives. And here comes a big, strong man. And that was part of the Cuomo persona, was the tough talking Italian guy from Queens, and he's very good at it. It fit perfectly. And you had all of these people swooning. It really, it's an episode that I hope in the years to come, clear-headed people reassess, because in a way it was quite disturbing to see.
There are, however, exceptions to the rule when it comes to disasters saving the political careers of authoritarians. Israel's current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has benefited from conflicts numerous times. In 2015, for instance, he was able to win a significantly large number of votes for his Likud party thanks to no small part to a war in Gaza the previous year. However, as time passed and when Netanyahu became the longest-serving PM in Israel's history, his luster began to fade. He began to lose credibility with the public. It seems to have reached a nadir in the aftermath of Hamas's attack of October 7, 2023, and polls project that Bibi will lose the upcoming Israeli election in a landslide.
The current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has a lot in common with Rudy Giuliani. You're talking about very charismatic, very scandal-scarred, strong men who understand how to get power and keep it. And the question is, will the halo around Netanyahu remain the way it did around Bush for years to come? And will people overlook the real strategic failures in Israel? Because, I mean, the hard questions, and journalists in Israel are asking them, why was Hamas able to storm easily across the border and start killing people? Wait a second. This is supposed to be Netanyahu's bread and butter. This is supposed to be the far right's bread and butter. Security. That's what they preach. That's what they argue for.
While the myths of Churchill or Thatcher have yet to be dispelled, Netanyahu reminds us that the Churchill Complex doesn't always last. Sometimes the public sobers up and faces reality, and their once fervent support will wear off. For Bush Sr., it happened when the broken promise of tax cuts began to overshadow the pro-war sentiments. For Bush Jr., it was the financial crash that pushed his approval rating into the 30% range. For Cuomo, it was the revelation of the nursing home scandal as well as the allegations of sexual harassment. There also may be signs that even Zelensky's popularity might be waning. Some of his former allies, like the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, claim that Zelensky has become as autocratic as Putin, and Ukraine will no longer be any different from Russia, where everything depends on the whim of one man. And then there is, of course, the fall of Rudy Giuliani. When he was still riding high, Giuliani tried to parlay the windfall from the disaster of 9/11 into a bigger jackpot. And so, Giuliani ran for president in 2008. It was something he had dreamed of since high school. But as almost a decade had passed since 9/11, Americans were sobering up from their Churchill Complex, and Rudy failed to carry a single state in the Republican primaries. However, at that point, it wasn't as if most people had a negative view of Giuliani. He was still viewed as a bipartisan figure in 2008. It actually took another decade for Giuliani to truly burn down his reputation as America's mayor.
I think hitching up with Trump was the beginning of the end, because even then there were enough people who would give him credit for the crime decline in the 1990s. And that still was the defining aspect of his legacy. Whether that was valid or not, it was the central aspect of Rudy, was the guy who tamed New York City, so to speak. And there were a lot of Democrats, usually white Democrats, who felt that way. But I think when he hitched on with Trump, he became a deeply partisan figure. So he was someone who completely lost the center left, even the center. And it wasn't like he developed this great new following with Republicans. I think they were there for Trump. They weren't there for his crazy lawyer. So he was really a man without a tribe at the end of the day, because he'd never be a true Republican, and the left had written him off completely. And and of course, all the scandals, really finished him. If Giuliani had just been a bit less egotistical he could have taken his money and ran. He became a successful lawyer. He's making millions a year. His presidential campaign didn't go so well, crash and burn, but people's campaigns fail.
Yeah.
You can still be Giuliani, the 9/11 hero, and milk that for the rest of your life, but he had to keep going. Trump came along and he had to be in the White House. He had to be the Trump lawyer. He could not resist that spotlight. As you lift yourself up further and inflate your own myth, you set yourself up for a fall. And you really do. You create enemies, and you start to not understand your own failures. You lose any self-awareness that was left.
This is the final lesson for us. Yes, Rudy Giuliani has now had a spectacular downfall, and in retrospect, it is incredible that such a right-winger became mayor of one of the most liberal cities in America. But as most of us still remember Winston Churchill fondly, or how Andrew Cuomo was immensely popular just a few years ago, we live in a political landscape where the public can still be easily deceived by rhetoric and spectacle alone. So long as there is a potential for an unexpected disaster to come along and traumatize the public, democracies remain vulnerable to authoritarians who can manipulate the trauma for their own benefit. Rudy Giuliani had a downfall, but the jingoism and nationalism that created America's mayor still persists. We can still easily be deceived by an authoritarian promising to save us. In these turbulent times, we are more susceptible than ever to the Churchill Complex. We still live in a political climate that will pave the way for the next Rudy Giuliani. As I stated in part 1 of this series, Rudy Giuliani had always been the same person. While those who used to worship him during the 9/11 era have convinced themselves that Giuliani has somehow become a different person, Donald Trump was one of the few who understood the dark truth. As he stated during the 2016 presidential victory speech at the Hilton Hotel in Midtown, in the very same ballroom where the Inner Circle dinner took place.
Very special. I want to give a very special thanks to our former mayor, Rudy Giuliani. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. He traveled with us and he went through meetings. See that, Rudy? It never changes. Where's Rudy? Where is he?
Rudy's story ends in a full circle. Giuliani's performance at the Hilton Hotel 16 years prior was, to quote Churchill, the end of the beginning, just before he reached his peak as America's mayor. But as Ross Barkan stated, hitching up with Trump was the beginning of the end. No longer the star of the show, Giuliani's old sidekick had stolen the center stage away from him. We can speculate that there is perhaps a part of Rudy that actually resents Donald Trump. Unlike the real estate tycoon who was born with a silver spoon, Giuliani actually had to claw his way up to the top. He came from a working-class Italian-American family in Brooklyn. One of his uncles was a mob boss and the other was a crooked cop who used his badge to protect his brother. And he had 3 cousins killed within the 5-year period. Early in his life, Rudy's career choices were narrow, but he ended up graduating from law school with the honor of magna cum laude. He then became the nation's youngest associate attorney general, and he was elected twice as the Republican mayor of one of the most liberal cities in America. Unlike Trump, who stumbled into the White House, we must admit that Rudy Giuliani still has impressive qualities. But he's still his father's son, a fighter destined to lose, and a criminal waiting to be caught. His father's take no prisoners, show no mercy qualities that Rudy inherited earned him success at first, but they were inevitably fated to push him too far. Like Icarus, his everlasting desire to rise to the highest echelons of power was destined to result in a spectacular fall. It was an incredible sight to see him getting booed in his beloved Yankee Stadium, the very same place where Oprah proclaimed him America's mayor. There aren't many former presidential candidates who settled on making videos on the website Cameo. Rudy Giuliani has always worked hard, he has always fought. But from his legal challenges to the leaked transcript of his sexual advances to his ex-employees, the walls are closing in. He has filed for bankruptcy after being ordered to pay $145 million for having falsely accused 2 Georgian women for fraud after the 2020 presidential election. He has to face the ultimate indignity. With no money or allies left, Rudy Giuliani is now as poor as the average nobody, and he would have to live the rest of his life like a schnuck.